Okay, lesson 8, part 2, here we go. There was some confusion on these parts of the Delta Math assignment, which I totally get because they were not part of the video. So here we go. What are we going to do when we see a graph like this on Delta Math? First of all, we're going to notice that they have vertical asymptotes, except for we can't see them. So let's go ahead and put them in so we can see more clearly. We see when x is equal to -6, there's a vertical asymptote. We can tell that because there's no value for y when x equals -6. Same thing when x is equal to -3. There's no value. We can see that the graphs approach the absolute value, or I'm sorry, they approach the vertical asymptote, but they do not touch it, nor do they cross it, all right? So how are we going to represent this, the domain of this? So first of all, we still work from the left, okay? We're looking at the x-axis. We're looking at the left, and we see that, whoa, that arrow means that we are going to start our domain at -infinity. But then as we're coming to the right, we see that at -6, we come to a screeching halt. There's nothing there. So when there's nothing there for when x is equal to -6, and nothing means there's no y value, then -6 is not part of our domain because there's not a graph at -6. So we would stop there, and the first part of our domain is going to be that -infinity, which we use parentheses because we never use brackets for infinity, and we stop at -6. We're using parentheses because -6 is not part of our domain. It's not included. We only use brackets when we can include a number, and in this case, -6 is not part of it. Now we have a second part to our domain, and some of you know this from last year, whether you were in honors or whether you learned it on your own. When we have two parts of the domain, we have to use the word or. But instead of writing or, we use the letter U. U, worldwide, means or. That's why math is a worldwide language, right? Because everyone knows what parenthesis -infinity, comma -6, close parenthesis means, and everyone knows that U means or. We use U, we use or, because the domain is either x can be either from -infinity to -6, or it can be from, and I'm going to pause because I realize I need to add something to this, so hold on. Okay, so I had to quickly fix, there are three parts to this domain, which I get why this was difficult with Delta Math, but we can do this. So the first part we describe leads up to that first vertical asymptote. That's -infinity to -6. And then we talked about how we use U when we mean or, and with domain we have to use U because x can either be -infinity to -6, or x could be the next group. Now let's look at the next group. There's no value of the graph when x is equal to -6. But there is a value for the graph from all the way from -6 to -3. And so we're going to write that as from -6 to -3. When x is from -6 to -3, there is a value for y. We see a graph. Now, do we see a graph when x is equal to -6? No, but we have to, that's why we use the parenthesis. But certainly we see a graph when x is equal to -5.999999999. So that's why we have to use that -6. Same thing with -3. We have to use -3 because while there's not a graph when x is equal to -3, there is a graph at -2.99999, or rather in this case, there is both ways. There is a graph at -3.0000001. Okay, so that's why we use -6 and -3, but we use parentheses to say that we don't include -6 and -3 in our domain. All right, so then there's a third part. So x could either be the first part or the second part, or x could be the third part where our x starts at -3 but not included because there's no value. I don't see a graph when x is equal to -3 all the way until x is infinity, right? So that's the third part. What I want you to do is pause this, write the notes down, think of any question that you have, and come back during the Zoom time to ask me questions. But you have to do some thinking. This is what's tough about Chapter 1. It looks simple, but it's really not. It involves thinking. So please do your thinking first. Also, do not touch this, the interval. You want to keep the answer type as interval. You only type in your interval into that second box. So let's look at another problem that you may have. Here, we have a lot of gaps for our domain. Okay, so the first part of our domain, we're going to look at the very far left, and we're going to notice that we have an asymptote in place at -5. Um, we're going to start our domain where x can be anything to the left, all the way to -infinity. And then as we work to the right, the domain comes to a screeching halt at -5. There is no graph at -5. So the first part of our domain is going to say from -infinity to -5. And then we notice, wait a minute, there's no graph at -4 or -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. Even at 3, we're going to notice that there's a vertical asymptote when x is equal to 3. But that's where the domain picks up again. So the domain can be from -infinity to -5, or the domain can start again at 3, but not include 3. There is no graph at 3. That's why we use a parenthesis. But there is a graph at 3.01 and even 3.0000001. That's why we don't start with like 3.1, because we have to start with 3 and not include it. So that would include the 3.000000001. And of course that, as we work to the right, we see that arrow, and that arrow implies that there's a value for the graph when x is so huge that we just use infinity to describe that. All right, and then there was a domain one that I thought looked a little bit tricky, because domain is height, right? And if we get our vertical line and we look at the height, let's get a line real quick. So if we look at this and we look at our vertical line, we're like, well, that arrow implies that our vertical line is going to keep going up, and our height, right, is going to be infinity. And of course, we don't start our range or our domain by the highest, right? We start with the lowest. So let's see how low the height is. Whoops. Let's see how low the height is. The low, once again, because that arrow implies that we're starting at -infinity and we end at +infinity. But some people are like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Yeah, you know what? We ignore those. Those are actually called relative maxes and mins. But as far as our range, we're just going to pay attention to the absolute, how tall it gets and how low it gets, the absolute maxes and the mins. So we're going to describe this range as being from -infinity to +infinity. Okay, I hope that filled in some of the missing pieces that it caused you to not do well on the last Delta Math. I truly apologize for that. So go ahead and take your notes and come back to Zoom and ask me questions. Thanks for joining me.